Hey, it's Jag, and today we're playing with stereo guitar rigs.
Yeah.
So ever since the first mass-produced stereo disc was released in November 1957, musicians, producers, engineers have been absolutely fascinated with ways to utilize that stereo sound field to get more realism in their recordings. Of all the musicians, various stripes of musicians, the ones who probably have the most abundance of the look at me gene is guitar players. We are a crazy bunch, and we are always looking for ways to have people pay more attention to what we're doing and have what we're doing sound more interesting. And stereo has really become a staple for many guitar players. Originally, I was going to call this video Why You Don't Need a Stereo Rig. But in doing some of the work on this, I've realized I've been bitten by the stereo bug again, and it really does sound great. It probably merits actually going through how you set up a stereo rig, what are the benefits of a stereo rig, and what are the pluses and minuses. Given the right conditions, stereo definitely adds a layer of dimension to your guitar tones. There are times, though, when it's not appropriate to have a stereo signal chain. I'll go into that later. What got me started on this was one of the Facebook groups I'm a member of. I make no secret that I absolutely love the Two Notes gear. You can see over behind me on top of my VVT, I've got my original Captor 8, my Captor X, and my Cab M+. So I'm definitely well invested in Two Notes, and as I've said before, I'm not very likely to ever go back to using a cabinet in the studio, live sessions, whatever. There are only two things that I miss about having a live cabinet. One is the ability to lean up against it and get some feedback. There are other ways to accomplish that. And the biggest thing that I miss is just having my pants flapping in the wind of a cabinet behind me. And that's where stereo can really help when you're using a direct signal. It really gives you a sense of space and dimension and feel. So there are very valid reasons to have a stereo guitar signal chain. So with that said, I'm going to go through basically the most common 4 or 5 ways of developing a stereo rig. I'm not going to use any of my amps today. I may use the high watt. I'll give it a little love. I've been kind of using the tri-watt for things a lot lately since I built it, but that will come later. I'm going to use Amplitube 5. I've been using Amplitube for years, probably 12 years, something like that, 10, 12 years. I first started using it when I was going on vacation, and I wanted to be able to practice. Since that time, modeling has gotten really good. So I have no problem using Amplitube for this video today. It makes it really easy to demonstrate the different ways to set up in this case, stereo rig, without having to patch and repatch my pedal board and my amps and all of that stuff. So I'll be using Amplitube today, but these principles apply to virtually any guitar signal chain. You just need to make a few tweaks for your situation. So that said, let's get on to demonstrating the rigs. The first two are going to be what I call old school rigs, and they're rigs that they're tones, ways of going stereo, or at least using 2 tracks of guitar that I really resonate with. I first went on tour, started my career as a touring musician in in late 1982, and I traveled as a touring musician, made my living exclusively that way up until about 1991. And so very much what I call old school, that was sort of at that time. The advent of stereo guitar effects and things really kind of blew up just sort of at the beginning of that time, 80, 81, 82, that sort of thing. Before that, we all mostly ran mono, and even amps at that time, it wasn't really common to have an effects loop. So my first two demonstrations will be what I call old school dry wet, which we didn't really call it at that time, and old school stereo. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was not really a lot of there were not really a lot of guitar players using stereo rigs. So a typical rig would have been mono, basically one amp and a few pedals. A lot of the greatest music ever made, especially in rock, was made that way. A guitar into a couple pedals, an amp, that was it. Okay, before I get on to demonstrating the old school dry wet rig, I just thought I'd do a couple of examples of how the traditional mono guitar rig works. So again, I've got JCM 800 model up here in Amplitube, and I've got a compressor in there, a diode overdrive, noise gate, and then a mono chorus and mono delay. So here's an example of just the dry sound, the dry crunch sound. It kind of goes like this. So that would have been a very basic but very common guitar chain back in the late 70s and early 80s. Just a JCM 800 with some kind of overdrive punching the front. Sometimes you'd turn on a compressor just to get a little bit of extra boost and sustain. Here's that sound, same riff. So pretty basic, pretty classic rock kind of sound. The thing that really happened in the early part of the 80s was people started using chorus pedals and delay pedals. They were still mono as well, but they just gave you the ability to add some dimension to your mono signal. I was really big on chorus when it came out, for trying to give a more expansive sound to my rig. Here's how that mono chorus signal chain sounds with the same riff. And of course, a lot of people at that time used it for very clean sorts of sounds. So with the overdrive off, just the chorus on and into this on edge of breakup JCM 800, and you roll the volume back a little bit, and you can get a pretty sweet clean tone. And a compressor, again, would make that pop just a little more. So that was kind of the basic rig that I started with touring. Eventually, when I started making a little bit of money, I got a delay pedal, which also adds a whole other element to that. If you bring a little bit of delay in there with the chorus on and the overdrive on, I'll leave the compressor on too, so sort of a high gain, sort of swirly doubled mono guitar sound. So you can hear that tail out, and that's one thing I used to do. I often would use my delay only on solos, and I would set it up so that when I would stop playing a note, you'd get that do, do, do going on after, you know, so you could. But you were kind of limited what you could do with delay because it was going into the front end of a crunchy amp. As I said, there weren't effects loops weren't very common, and so your delay trails would actually be boosted by the fact that you were running into a crunchy amp. So you were a little bit limited on what you could do with that, but you could make them work. Eddie Van Halen is a really good example of that. You listen to some of the things off the first album, and it was a delay, his guitar going into delay and then into the amp, and you would get that quick sort of slap back kind of tone. You could kind of work with that, you know. So anyway, that's the basic setting. And again, the delay really did a lot to open up clean tones, even more than just using a chorus, you know. Just a little bit of roominess there. So now that we've covered that, let's talk about the old school dry wet rig. Here's what I've set up as an old school dry wet. So when I was on the road and I first started touring, it was not much different then than it is now in terms of trying to make a living. You kind of didn't really make a lot of money, and we were doing it for the love of it. When we did start doing a little bit better and could afford some more things, the first thing I did was bought a second amp head. I was using high watt. That's still my favorite amp flavor, still sort of the main amp I go with, the high watt or the tri watt, which is a high watt flavor. My second amp was a JCM 800. So when I was able to get that, one of the first things I did do was start kind of playing around with what I called the stereo rig at the time. It really was a dry wet rig. That's what we would call it now. And that was where I took the same basic rig that I was using, very similar to this, still a compressor in front and an overdrive in front and noise gate. And then I would split that. I had just a simple splitter that I built, basically a Y cable would do the same thing, but I built it into a box. And then out of there, I would go straight into my high watt still, but then on the JCM side, I would put my chorus and my delay there, so I could get a little bit more movement on one side of the stereo spectrum. But my main sound was still straight through. I got the idea, and I think a lot of other people got that idea from the original Roland JC120, and then the chorus ensemble, the original CE1 or CE2, CE1 I think, which had a dry out, or it had a left-right out, but actually what it was one side was the dry signal out, and the other side was the affected signal. And the JC120, being a stereo amp, had a unique kind of sound, and I think people kind of got the idea to do this dry wet sort of setup from that. Anyway, that's where I got the idea. So again, I put my chorus and my delay just going into my JCM 800. So with those devices turned off right now, it's just still a mono chain. It's just through 2 amps. Right away, though, you can hear the added sort of dimension that a second amp does give you in that context. So. So it's a mono signal, but you can hear it. One amp is in the left ear, one is in the right ear. One's on the left side, one's on the right side. And that's the way I used that live. So it still is a stereo chain. It's just not very broad. So again... But the thing that really made that come to life for me was when I put the chorus on. So we got a little bit of that swirliness happening on the one side, and that really made that stereo broadness start to open up. It's not quite as broad as a stereo rig, a modern stereo rig would be, but at that time it sounded massive. So here's with the chorus on the JCM 800, just on one side, and the straight JCM on the other side. So you can hear how that's opened up quite a bit. And of course, trying it, I put my delay there. Again, that just kind of gave you that trail and pulled you in that direction when you would stop playing. So the same riff with the chorus and delay. So that kind of just tweaks you on one side of the stereo spectrum and gave it a little bit more broadness. And again, when you would do a solo and a stop, you'd still get that tail out that kind of would be really interesting, a really interesting punctuation at the end of a line. So that's the wet dry rig, the old school dry wet rig, and it is a stereo setup. So the next rig that I'm going to demonstrate is what I call old school stereo. So as you saw in the old school dry wet, we had two amps, one left and one right, but the effects were still mono effects. We had a mono chorus and a mono delay on one side of the field. Some people, Adrian Ballou comes to mind, he would take two mono pedals and put one in each side and run them, what I recall him calling it was true stereo. So he had a separate, completely separate chorus on the left and the right. You could kind of even expand your stereo field more that way. Around the mid-80s, early to mid-80s, Boss in particular started coming out with stereo chorus pedals, stereo delays, and people were then able to get a truer stereo representation of the field. So still, a lot of amps at that time did not have effects loops. They were becoming more popular, and they were also becoming very popular as a mod. Here's an example of what I call the stereo rig, and the real change, as I said, from the old school dry wet, is in the old school stereo rig, we had a stereo chorus and a stereo delay that we could run after our splitter. Still going into the front end of the amp. Also, a lot of devices at that time still didn't have a stereo input. So if you had one of those, you might have your chorus in front of a delay that only had a mono input and a stereo output. For the sake of the argument here, I'm just using a stereo digital chorus and a stereo delay. But they're still going into the front end of the amp, and that's sort of the key difference between what I call old school stereo rigs and modern stereo rigs. Most modern amps now either have effects loops in them, so you can put your modulation and your delay after the preamp, after all the crunch and the gain, or using IR loaders and reactive loads to actually go to our delay and modulation even after the cab, the IR, so after the amp and everything else, a lot more like it would be done in the studio. So we'll get to that when I do the modern stereo rigs. But this is what I call the old school stereo rig, and it kind of was the peak for the old school sort of setups. So again, stereo chorus, stereo delay going into two heads so that we can get delays on both sides. We can get the chorus moving between the two sides. Another thing, at least when I first did this, that I found was I could get away with using a lot less gain, which made my playing a lot more articulate. I'll just show you an example of that. I'll put the chorus on here. So we got a stereo chorus, and I do still have my overdrive and my compressor pedal. What I found was I didn't need to have that compressor. I didn't need to have that little extra bit of boost. So here's the sound with the stereo chorus on, same riff we've been playing, and you'll see the gain is actually very nice and smooth. Very reminiscent of the 80s LA guitar sound. But I found that I could turn the compressor off and I could get just a more in-your-face kind of guitar sound, a more articulate sound where you could hear the notes more. So here's with the compressor turned off. The overdrive, of course, is still on. So very nice. It's moving between the left and the right. It's a very crisp sound. It's still nice and gainy, but it's got some clarity to it. That for me was a thing that I really liked when I first went stereo. So that's with the chorus. I remember a lot of guys at the time, they'd make a choice between a stereo chorus or a stereo delay. I was lucky enough to be able to afford both. They were not too expensive, but again, you didn't make a lot of money at that time. I guess a lot like it is now on the road. But so some guys would go with a delay. One of the things I liked about the delay, when I did the dry wet rig, I had a longer tail on the delay, which I liked. It was more roomy, and I still like that. Usually about a 330 millisecond delay. I really like that and like to have that on my guitar and leave it on. But one of the things that I really learned when I went to my first stereo digital delay was to use a shorter delay. That was another thing we could do. Older delays couldn't necessarily go this short. I got my first digital delay, and I found that if I went with about a 30 millisecond delay on one side and a 60 on the other, it really started to sound like a double-tracked guitar setup. So that's what I've said on here, and you'll hear that. First, here again without the delay or chorus on. So it's okay, but kind of flat, you know, especially after listening with the chorus. But here, if I put that delay on, again, 30 millisecond on one side, 60 millisecond on the other, and just listen how much broader it sounds. Right away, it just makes the guitar sound big. It sounds like two guitar players are playing. Another thing that happens with those very short delays, there's a field of psychology that I really have an interest in, which is called psychoacoustics, and it's the way sound can play tricks with you. And with short delays like this, what you find is the guitar seems to be coming from one side. I forget the relationship, whether that first delay arrives first and you think that's louder, or whether the one that comes later sort of draws your ear that way. But it does make your guitar or anything sound like it's predominantly coming from one side, but at the same time it sounds like it's everywhere. Just give it a listen again here. So to me, in my phones, what I'm hearing, it sounds like the guitar is kind of more over here, but I'm hearing it everywhere. It just seems like it originates there. So the one other thing I'll show you on this old school stereo, it's only a matter of time before a guitar player turns everything on. And I definitely did that. So I went stereo chorus into stereo delay, again with that doubling delay, and that was, I was hooked on that sound. I used that sound forever. You know, I mean, to the point I think some people actually wished I would have turned it off. Anyway, here's the sound, stereo chorus into stereo delay, into the front end of 2 amps. So sort of the peak old school stereo sound. So again, much broader. There's movement. It seems big. It seems like it's everywhere. So that's still one of my favorite stereo rigs. By the way, I haven't shown you the version of this cleaned up. This is where it really gets big. And I will turn the compressor back on here just because it makes these harmonics pop. This is another sound that was just massive for that time. It sounded like the guitar was everywhere. So that short delay on there doesn't work so well with that, but you can already see how much bigger the clean sound is. I'm going to go back here and I'm going to change the delay to a bit longer. Again, I'll go 330 milliseconds, and I'll bring up the feedback maybe about 12%. And for clean, to me, this just really did it for a clean sound. Well, maybe not so much of that. Sorry, I forgot. I got to take the mix down. That was the other trick to the doubling delay, was to have your mix at least at 50%. If you went too far, you would start losing the dry signal. That worked okay for chorus, but for delay, it's obvious what the problem would be. So I'm going to take that down to about 6%. So just very far in the background. Okay, so here we are. The mix is turned way back, so we just got the delay just filling in things a bit, and the chorus is moving us back and forth. And you can hear that bigness to the chorus. The delay is just there filling things out, and the chorus is moving things back and forth, and just that sound is that's a very representative sound of that time, the mid to late 80s, the clean sounds, and how chorus and reverb were used for making a sound, a clean sound very big, or making a gainy sound double tracked. That's it for the old school stereo rigs. Today we did a old school mono setup, an old school what we would call dry wet, and an old school stereo setup. So that's the end of part one, as I said. In the next part of this series, we'll look at modern stereo rigs. Thanks for watching, like always. Like and subscribe, and check out my band One Soul Thrust. The links, as always, are down below.